Yeah, so let's go ahead and start with some introductions, since I am the common thread between you two. So go ahead and introduce yourselves to one another.
Well, Rozella, you go ahead.
Okay. My name is Rozella Haydée White. I am a coach, a leadership consultant, and a content creator based in Houston, Texas. And I own a consulting firm called RHW Consulting. What else should I be saying?
So kind of like your role in faith communities, the role that you've had in like curating online communities, because this isn't a new practice for you.
Okay, yeah. So I was an active leader within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, also known as the ELCA, for any of the people that may be listening or watching later who don't know our speak. And I grew up in the church, in the mainline Protestant church, and my last role officially in the church was as director for young adult ministry for the ELCA, for the denomination, and I was based in Chicago. I have been someone who has not only been a curator of online community, but an active participant in online community since online community was a thing, right? So whether it was early days of like AOL and chat, to MySpace when I was in high school, to Black Planet, to, the beginning of Facebook, I've always been someone who is an early adopter. Or adapter when it comes to social movements and the use of technology. And then I actually engaged more deeply in that space, probably about 10 years now, a little over 10 years ago. As someone who lives with mental illness, I was invited into spaces that were support groups for women who were living with depression and anxiety disorders. And that fundamentally shifted how I understood online community and the power that online community could have, that digital resource could have in both nurturing community, in engaging folks, and in creating opportunities for people to be connected and be connected in real and profound and deeply engaging ways. And so recently that's looked like me doing initiatives that were online conversations. When I was in my previous role, especially around the Pulse shooting in Orlando, we hosted an online webinar and conversation, which I realize now was like the first of its kind, to gather together leaders to process, LGBTQ folks to process and to think reflectively and theologically. Tuhina was a part of a cohort called the ELCA Young Adult Cohort that engaged issues of justice and the intersections between faith and justice and culture. And that had online components. So whether it was inviting people to blog about their experiences or engaging people in digital community outside of our in-person gatherings. And then there's other ways that I've done that as well, in addition to most recently being a part of the Triduum Project, which is this 54-hour live stream happening over these 3 days as we reflect on the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So I'm someone who is a fan, who believes that digital community is absolutely powerful, and low key, if I can be a little bit petty right now, am kind of like upset that everyone is coming online and like, oh, this is incredible. And I'm like, we've been saying this for over a decade. Like, it works. It's incredible. And I think the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is I'm someone who is extraordinarily collaborative. And so one of my hopes for people in this time is that they actually seek out people that know how to do this. Like, a pastor does not have to learn how to move their community online and take that on in the midst of everything else. There are people who know how to do this, who would love to partner with your community to create spaces.
My name is Bobby. I own a content development storytelling agency here in Anderson, South Carolina, Number 2 Creative. It's nothing more than a couple of us that really are digital storytellers. I'm also I wouldn't call myself a professor. I mean, people call me a professor, but I don't.
You're an educator, definitely.
I'm an educator. I teach on the academic levels, undergraduate, graduate, and professional development through both Anderson University and Clemson University. I also, the reason why my intersection here is with the digital church is I started a blog probably earlier this year mainly because I was fascinated with the idea of the intersection of faith and digital communications. As a professional communicator and one that kind of works with organizations across the Southeast to tell stories, I started to realize that our church here at Boulevard Baptist, which is a part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, really needed guidance and leadership when it came to bringing the church online in a digital space. So social media, bringing communities online. What does that mean for the church when it comes to privacy, child protection, all those pieces that we deal with in the church? And then, so I chair the communications committee that has a seat at the church council. And for the last year, we have been really working hard to understand how digital is going to impact the church. And about a year and a half ago, the Missions Council invested in live stream capabilities. And what I mean by invested, the Missions Council put a couple $1,000s together. I think it's about $4,000. And I went and bought a MacBook Pro. I bought some software. I bought one camera, and started live streaming our services. And what I found is that I'm very thankful that we started that journey a year and a half ago and used a lot of my experience, that now here we sit and we're perfectly positioned for that opportunity. And so it's been a learning journey. And so I've been sharing that with our other CBF related churches, and not really the big churches, because some of the larger urban CBF churches have the resources, they have the capabilities, they have the wherewithal and the commitment to those types of technologies. It's these medium to smaller churches, the rural churches, that really are struggling to figure out what that intersection of faith and digital communication, especially when it comes to, is it engaging your congregation or is it evangelizing outside of the congregation? And so I think that's a powerful conversation. So anyway, that is me in a nutshell. And I'm a husband, twin boys, 2.5, daughter 8. I live in a small town and I freaking love it.
Well, and also part of like what drew us together in these conversations, also like you also have the history of journalism, and what does it mean to tell the story in this particular point in time in history, and engaging with people and their stories of what is it to be a faith leader, what is it to be part of a community, what is it to curate digital community and digital spaces that have meaning, in a time where we are so physically distanced from one another. And I think like between Bobby and me, I couldn't think about like somebody who, you know, we've known each other for quite a few years. We were in graduate school together for the professional communication program, but we are so like opposite physically distant. It's kind of ridiculous.
And here we are. I'm sitting in South Carolina. She's sitting in Palo Alto. You're sitting in Houston. I think it's fun. To me, number one, this is a great time where we can intersect among different faith communities. And what I mean by that is whether you're denominationally or outside of the denominations in a different faith perspective, and come and sit and have conversations in real time while events that will shape the world are happening. I tell my students, I'm like, you know, my big event in my lifetime was 9/11 when I was in grad school. And I will forever remember that, you know, the morning that I woke up and how that unfolded and really impacted me. And I remind my students, you know, on our Zoom calls on Wednesday mornings, I'm like, if there's ever a time, especially in the class that I teach, it's communication literacy. We need to be talking about projects and exploration about now, because when you look back 10 and 15 years ago, you're going to pull out the writings that you did and the research you did to help share the story of something that truly impacted your life. And I remember when we were in rhetoric class, and I was in the midst of, you know, this classical rhetoric class, and they were the class was to meet that Thursday night. Was it Thursday night? Yeah, it was Thursday night of 9/11. And the planes had crashed that morning. I remember, or was it Tuesday night? I can't remember. It was Tuesday. Sorry, my bad. And we were meeting that Tuesday night. So anyway, and we walked in the door and he was like, class is going to happen and we're doing it on purpose. And I want you to sit down and free write. And I want you to use the most recent readings that you had taken part in. And so I sat and wrote that night, and every year I pull that writing up. I call it the Still Bird's Persuasion. And I pull it out, and it helps me remember what it felt like at that point in time in life, so that we never remember not so much the events, but the adjectives and the emotion behind it. And so that's the joy of storytelling in the digital church, is that, we're in a time period where we're not only trying to help people find those intersections, but we're actually telling the story in real time in a way that if we capture it and capture the adjectives and we capture the moment in time and we capture the events and all those small little words, and our children and their children are going to be able to teach these things beyond the digital word of mouth. They will be able to put context behind it because we're connected to it. And so that's one of the things I love about this time period, is being able to connect with people across the country and talk and record it, so that when we discern together and we archive it so that we can share it later, And so I just love this idea of connecting this way.
And I think part of, Rozella, why I really wanted to engage with you in discussion in what do our stories mean in this point in time, is that you helped co-create a space for church leaders in this point in time. Because I think it's one thing to be a member of a faith community, but also then to be a leader in a faith community and to shepherd people through this time that is incredibly traumatic. And who is looking after the leaders of the faith communities, and that's where you have stepped in. And so I was wondering if you could tell us some of that story about like what LEAD is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I consult with an organization called LEAD, which stands for Living Each Day or Living Every Day as Disciples. And we are a faith-based, a Christian nonprofit leadership development organization that was birthed out of a desire and I think a deep wish that we could support leaders, faith leaders, as they nurture deep, bold, consequential faith, not only within themselves, but obviously within those that they are accompanying. And we really talk about three things: spirituality, adaptive leadership, and transformation. Like those are the three, if you will, impetus of our work, or the three undergirding I'm losing words. Those are the three things that undergird our work, right? And in my own life, right, I've always been one who has nurtured leaders, whether it was young people, young adults, older folks, and I also coach leaders. And while I am particularly interested in the type of leaders that they develop and become, right, like the skills, the gifts that are nurtured within them to lead and to lead well, I am specifically interested in the care of our leaders' souls. And I don't say that, I'm a progressive, so I'm not talking about I'm worried about where they're going after they die. But when I talk about their souls, I'm thinking more about their holistic well-being, right? Their mind, their body, their heart, and their spirit. Because one of the things we know, and I think both of you all know this, right? Leaders tend to have higher rates of everything when it comes to illnesses in their bodies. We also find that a lot of our leaders are spiritually dormant. My dear friend Layla Ortiz, who's bishop of the Metro DC Synod, often talks about being spiritually dormant and sad, right? Our souls are sad. We see that a lot of leaders don't take care of their emotional well-being. And honestly, outside of seminary and theological education, even their mental well-being, they're not necessarily engaging things that deal with other industries or other sectors that they then use and reflect on for their own ministry. And so I'm really concerned with the holistic care of leaders. And as soon as this started, I would also say my background is in disaster chaplaincy and spiritual care. And I live in the Gulf Coast region and have been active as a leader during major events of hurricanes, floods. So there is a way of engaging in disaster that we just know how to do here. And even though COVID-19 is a very different reality, there are some elements of crisis care and support that have come up. So right when this started, you know, I had spoken to my partners over at LEAD and was like, I really would like to do something that is caring for the personhood of our leaders, right? There are these groups that are forming that are really focused on the task of ministry. How do we move to digital community? You know, how do we provide pastoral care in crisis? How do we continue on with our holy days and festivals, right? There are all of these groups and resources and amazing content that is about the task of ministry, but I wasn't seeing those many spaces that were about the care of the leader. And so I developed an initiative called Leading in Crisis, Holistic Care for Leaders. And it is looking especially at those things, the mind, body, spirit, and heart of our leaders during this time. And so we have an online group that has, including myself, 5 facilitators. 2 of those facilitators are in public health, but they actually work at the intersection of public health, faith, and justice. So they're bringing an expertise around medical issues, but also healthcare and public health in these times. One of the facilitators is a pastor and a licensed professional counselor who is helping with clergy care and mindfulness. Another pastor, David Hansen, is one who is also interested in and has been leading in digital community. And then there's myself, who brings kind of the coaching lens and the heart and spirituality nurturing. And so this is an online group to start with, but the hoped for, I think, future is that this becomes an ongoing movement with a variety of touch points that really invites leaders across the country to spend some time caring for themselves and reflecting on how their care is actually necessary for leading well. So our tagline is, in order to lead well, you have to first be well. And I really want to engage that. And much like you shared earlier, Bobby, like this time, we have leaders from all over the country, from various denominations, that are now intersecting and interacting in ways that they didn't before this, right? So there is some gifts and graces that are coming out of this. And can I also just say, like, when you shared about, Bobby, the work of reflecting in the moment, so that we're able to go back and see the stories and artifacts that came out of this time, that really resonates with me. My background is sociology, and I've always been fascinated by both group behavior, the way that groups make meaning, and the stories that stand right past the moment. And one of the things I've been sharing with clients recently is this is a moment for deep introspection and reflection. And the hope is that after this moment, or through this moment, we're building resilience, right? And after this moment, then the stories and the art and the laments that came out of this time will be a part of our resiliency, right? So when we hit the next thing, because there will be another thing, we will have things to look back on and to reflect on. And I just think that storytelling from the beginning of time provides an incredible gift, because it helps us see that we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. And it helps us connect to places and spaces and people throughout history that have been in wilderness moments, that have been in struggle moments, that have been in hugely traumatic moments. And we are adding our stories to that in this moment now.
That's good stuff. It makes me think of 2 things. One is, first, a project I worked on about 8 years ago. And through that project, I kind of started working through. It's with the Duke Divinity School and the Duke Endowment, and then we were looking at the thriving rural church and how the church and the members of the church, the leaders of the church, basically their health and well-being was compromised because they spent so much time dedicated to their flock, they didn't know how to take care of themselves. And a lot of it came from not so much the spiritual well-being, but it was really physical well-being. You know, as a pastor, you get asked to come to dinner at the house or lunch at the house. Everything is about dinner and lunch and food. And so how to learn to walk in and have those times of fellowship, but don't have to feel like you have to eat, and how to take care of yourself physically, and to visit with your flock, but it doesn't have to be around food. And if it is around food, how to build those healthy relationships so that taking care of your flock is about taking care of your own physical well-being. And that really was fascinating because it was the beginning of me working with them to learn how to tell stories inside the rural church, and the longevity of the rural church, especially when many people were running away from the rural church to work, and how to get back to it. And their stories are just amazing, just fascinating stories of how pastor burnout is just phenomenal in these rural areas, and dual appointments and whatever it may be. And they hadn't even taken care of their own well-being. And so how do you manage that? And then the other thing it makes me think about in your conversation, Rozella, was as a journalist, we are trained to go into the most dramatic and traumatic situations. Bottom line, we know how to walk into Katrina. I'm waving at one of the pastors leaving the church. But being the doers and going into execution mode and capturing stories, and almost being a little bit, you could use the word aggressive, but intentional about breaking comfort zones in a respectful way in order to get those stories to capture, and knowing how to put yourself in a position to better document those times. And so, when after Katrina, I was done with Katrina and I walked out of that story, I was down there for 14 to 15 days, and I flew back into Charlotte, and I was basically in the midst of PTSD. And it's only because I captured so many stories and talked to so many people in crisis that I'd gone through that process, and I never took time to reflect on my own.
Yep.
And so it took me years to get over that. I think in truthfulness, I'm still probably dealing with a little bit of that PTSD, having to manage stressful situations. Example would be when my kids start going crazy and screaming and that's all they know how to do, I have to walk out of the house because that hysteria brings me back in those traumatic times, and let Sarah kind of manage all that. And it's just the honest truth, and so I can imagine pastors right now that are having to manage their own well-being. They're having to manage all of their other stuff, and then at the same time manage themselves.
And also kind of thinking about trauma lives in our bodies, and historical trauma lives in our bodies, because I think about generational trauma, particularly for communities of color and communities that have had to deal with some form of oppression. And I had shared with Rozella this morning that I fell asleep yesterday and slept through a meeting. And then when I realized that I actually had to participate in the meeting, I logged on and I fell asleep in the middle of the meeting.
Oh,
that's exactly what I texted her. I was like, oh, gee.
But then I was having a conversation. I was having a conversation with my friend Shonda, and Shonda's like, this is actually your body trying to protect you, because you're in Zoom meetings all the time. You're in crisis mode all the time. You're in a place where you're either trying to problem solve, or you're trying to glue back pieces that have been so far shattered that you really can't build the same thing again. And so your body is actually trying to your body's trying to give you a break, and you're not letting it.
Yeah, it is so interesting, this time period, especially when you talk about the idea of resiliency. Such a fascinating word. It's applied to many different places, many different industries, almost kind of loosely if you think about it. And I'd love to hear, Rozella, your thoughts here, is as we look on the other side, that other side may be, as you think through the many narratives that are going to come out and how our own narrative plays into it, what is the true resiliency, not only of the church, but of the people that support the church? Because the digestion of this time period is so magnanimous that it is really hard to, from a faith perspective, give it up. You know, just really just say, I no longer have control.
Listen.
I just don't have control. And I have to allow my ability to understand my faith perspective, to give back, to give it up, in that sometimes trying to have control is the worst possible thing that you could do in a time period where chaos is beyond the control. Does that make any sense whatsoever?
I mean, yeah, right? Like, I think everything makes sense now, even the most nonsensical, because of the time we live in, right? We're in the upside down, we're in the other space, the other side, right? There's a lot that we're all reflecting on and riffing on. I would say a few things. One is control is an illusion to begin with, right?
Yes.
And so the fact that so many people are kind of having a reckoning around control right now, I think is an apocalyptic moment in the truest sense of the word apocalyptic, in terms of a revelation, right? An uncovering that's happening. Because control, each and every day, we feel like we can control things, and we can't. We're not in control. And this, to go back to what you were saying earlier about the physical health of leaders, and I should say, yes, there have been those initiatives around physicality and leadership, but I feel like it's really tied to spirit and theological stuff, right? Issues of control, issues of ignoring one's capacity, issues of a lack of boundary, and issues of really thinking that everything resides within you, within me. That's a theological issue. And for faith leaders, I think we're long past the time to reckon with the fact that we are not God. We are not Jesus. We are not the Spirit. Is God, Jesus, the Spirit using us? Absolutely. Do our bodies matter? Yes. But we are not the perfect one, right? And so for me, one of the things when I think about resiliency, that I also find fascinating in this moment, is that those of us who have lived through like trauma as a regular part of our life are also engaging this moment differently than what I see in others who maybe have not, right? And so there was an article recently, and I'm looking for it again, but it was talking about those who live with mental illness, like specifically depression and anxiety, and how this moment is not necessarily that much different than every day. So I feel uniquely prepared.
Absolutely.
As
Just
someone
FYI, I sent that article to my therapist.
like, seriously,
Yeah.
it's just like, I am, my depression and my anxiety are superpowers right now, right? Like, I'm able to show up and it not be debilitating, right? So on the one hand, resiliency is bred and built through hardship, through difficulty, right? Through, and not just the things happening, but in terms of the reflection that we do on it, right? So that's where I agree with you in terms of, what do we mean by resiliency and how is it used? I mean, the military uses it, public sectors use it, faith-based spaces use it, but resiliency is not just about the things we've been through, but the ways that we've reflected on the things we've been through and the lessons that we extract from it that then we enact in the next hard time, right? And so for me, one of the best roles of faith communities is to remind people of where we have come from and where we have been through and what we have experienced, and to invite people into theological reflection about who God is in the midst of all of that, to increase people's capacity and their resiliency. And so I mean, I love the church. I love the church so much. And I'm one of the church's harshest critics, right? Times of crisis reveal what's been under the surface this whole time. The fact that and I wrote a piece about this on Wednesday, the fact that like people are really despairing, not just sad or not just grieving, but have lost all hope. It's interesting to me because it's like, what is the faith that we have actually been nurturing in people? What are the beliefs that we're actually propping up? And again, this is where I feel like leaders have to take accountability and responsibility for. Our people are following us. if we're not inviting them into those spaces, if we're not doing our part, right, it's not just on us, but we're not doing the part of nurturing the faith and digging deeper and giving people tools to explore their faith on their own or in their homes. In moments like this, we're seeing all that come to bear. And we see it within our leaders. I have leaders whose wheels are absolutely spinning, and I get it, right, from the crisis standpoint, but it's not the crisis that their wheels are spinning in, it's where is God that their wheels are spinning in. And not that we don't question that or wonder about that. Like I question God all the time. And yet, right, the faith that I hold on to is a faith that has been forged through generations, is a faith that comes out of my ancestry, is a faith that has been through worse than this, right? So when I think about resiliency and the particular role that faith leaders and faith communities have to play, it really is about helping people remember the stories not only of our faith and our faith tradition, but also their own stories.
You know, I've been thinking about, I'm in the middle of this project. I think I keep on bringing it up with all the interview people, but it's hard not to. I'm in the middle of this project where we're telling stories of the rural church, specifically individuals in North Carolina that are dual appointments in the United Methodist Church, and their funding mechanisms are slowly drifting away. And you can only maintain the physical building so long, and how much longer can the church itself continue to fund the appointments based on the giving and all those pieces. And you look at these pastors that came out of their fellowships and they were trained for the rural church. They were trained for the dual appointments. And they had to understand what it meant to build capacity to serve. And their plates are full. I mean, they're young. We're not talking about, individuals that are upper 40s that have gone through life situations. These are late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s that are in the beginning of life experiences or middle life experiences where they're shepherding churches, shepherding themselves, and shepherding their families and young families. And so their capacity is, their plate's full. It's over. It's like you went through the Shoney's line and you just dumped, and then you just added that fried chicken and you just added some more on top of that. And you're like, I want a big old piece of pie. And then you added a piece of cake and then just poured some whipped cream on top of that thing. You just walked in and said, all right, I'm ready to eat.
Yeah.
And there ain't no room to stuff it in.
Yeah.
And that is their plate right now. And that's been their plate for so many years. And so resiliency and capacity is so fascinating to me that the only way I think that a lot of these individuals are really understanding it is literally through their own faith journey and sharing it. And then through hearing other stories of individuals that are going through their faith journeys and these journeys so that they realize that they're not alone.
Yeah.
Connectivity is so powerful, and telling our story is so powerful because it's sometimes easier to recognize your own space when you are humbled enough to listen to someone else's space. And then you can see yourself in them.
Well, and there's something that I actually want to add to that, the space. Who is the space for in telling a story? Because Rozella, I've told you about who are these spaces created for? And I think in this time of physical distancing, I've never received so many invitations to be part of something in my life. There's an invitation to be, I have so many invites to be parts of conference calls, of Zoom gatherings. And I've had to be really selective of who gets my yes, who gets my energy, because I have very limited energy right now, as evidenced by me falling asleep in the middle of a meeting. but there is an online space where I did accept an invitation, but I haven't contributed because I didn't actually know if the space was for me until Rozella, you had actually posted something within this online community of, hey, who has voice right now? Because I think like that's also another realm that we really need to dive into in the digital church and in these digital spaces. If we're going to foster communication and leadership, and what does it mean to be digitally together within these spaces, who are the spaces for?
Well, and this is like the work though of nurturing digital community. So this is where also my annoyance and heckles raise when people don't recognize that digital community is the same, if not more, right, than in real life community. You have to work harder to create containers. You have to engage people in conversation. You have to set boundaries and guidelines. You have to invite, like all of those things, which we don't necessarily always do well in real life, are necessary for digital community to work and to be life-giving.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember in the early days of social media, right after, I think it was, probably my first Twitter account was 2008. And I started helping hospitals trying to figure out what that looked like for a system. And then you start looking at, okay, I'm a physician. What hat am I wearing today? Am I wearing my professional hat in this Twitter account or my personal hat? And how does HIPAA involved in that? And so drawing these lines and putting on your personal hat versus your professional hat, and what spaces are personal and what spaces are professional. And, you know, Facebook is a perfect example of that. It's an absolute perfect example, is that, do you actually sit down and think, how am I going to use Facebook? Is it for personal? Is it to share just pictures with my family? Or is it my space for my friends to have debate? Or is it my space to intersect my small business? You know, what are those spaces and what are the boundaries and how do we set expectations and where do we do that? And I think as digital consumers and digital activists, you know, especially in the Gen X, Gen Z communities where we're somewhat digital natives, is that we've had to evolve over time to understand what these spaces are and how we're going to manage our own personas in each space.
Absolutely.
And then beyond that is thinking through, is our voice too freaking loud in this space? And do we just need to shut up and listen? And that is a hard thing to manage, you know?
It really is. And I think, like, you know, if we're going to talk about like mainline Protestantism in the United States, like that is a very white created space.
Yes, amen.
Yeah, it's a very white,
is.
Yeah, it's a space that's really built for whiteness. And so that has been a harder thing for me to navigate in this time and place. Of, is it worth my energy to fight for place and space in a world where I already have to fight for place and space? You know, do I want to engage with this digitally if I'm receiving like, you know, 10 bajillion invitations for like Zoom happy hour or like sitting on the front stoop, like the Zoom front stoop or the Zoom courtyard? But it's also this realization of like where I currently serve. I haven't served in a white space, like a predominantly white space, for 2 years now. And now that I'm kind of like being brought back into those mainline spaces through digital community, like I've been struggling personally because of like, am I truly welcome in this space? Because like I've been second guessing myself like I had been in my first days in the ELCA.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. This is making me think of something else too. Like, so, and I'm going to talk about Black folks for a second, and I can do that because I am one. But like this notion of like, so Black people, right, are active on digital spaces and platforms, but we're active in different ways and on different platforms, right? So you'll find us, I mean, Black Twitter is a thing because we're there, right? Or, you know, I think about any space that's a creative space, whether it's TikTok now or Snapchat before, or, I mean, we're in spaces, and yet we're not the voices in our spaces that people hear, right? And that people follow and lead, and sometimes don't even consider ourselves that, right? So I actually, because digital storytelling and digital community is something even in my psyche that's for white people. I think Tuhina had tagged something in Jason, but like I didn't even have that way of thinking, because even in my life looking out, the people who do that and are lifted up the most are white folks, right? And so I'm reflecting on that in this moment too. Like, what does it look like for me and the skin that I'm in, and the person that I am, to actively claim that? But then also, why do we keep lifting up other white creators or digital curators instead of those people, and now I'll say of color, that have been and are also doing this? And I'm thinking about that now. Like, I want to be more intentional in this time of making sure that I'm connecting people to resources and communities that are curated for us, right? The whole FUBU notion, for us, by us, because that space is different. And a lot of us create it on our own, whether it's the text chains or the WhatsApp groups or the group me's, like I have with particular people of color, that's different than my other spaces. But like, I'm also thinking about how we lift those spaces up, and the fact, going to Hina, to your point, that every space isn't for everybody, but we keep thinking that it is.
It's
right?
not. It truly is not. It's, let's just accept the fact that I'm a good old-fashioned Southern white boy. And, Southern bred. I went to a Southern school. I wore khaki pants and a bow tie.
There is something about y'all from that part of South Carolina, because I was a chaplaincy with someone from that region who wore a bow tie every day.
I'm telling you, we love our bow ties, man. And the fascinating thing about this is that white privilege is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the literacy of white privilege is harder to accept than accepting white privilege itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because the interaction inside that space is hard to interact when you don't have language.
Mm-hmm.
And acceptance level and gainful knowledge of how to interact in those communities. And I think it's even harder, and I'm going to say this very lightly because I feel like it can come off as a white privilege tone, but for white men that understand that they have white privilege and want to break those barriers, it is learning how to decentralize our brain from what we've been taught
Mm-hmm.
on how to interact in these new spaces.
Absolutely.
And find our new space now in this new paradigm of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's hard. It really is. How do you train and raise the next boys, my two sons, to have the understanding and the knowledge and the empathy and the literacy of what it means to be white in today's society, and a white male, and to interact in a way that is respectful and that doesn't put you on a pedestal just because you're a color, and deprogramming those generational cues.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for people like me, where you walk in a room and you've been taught to think and act a certain way, to command the room and to lead the room, and learning how to step back and listen more and talk less.
Yes.
And that's hard for an egomaniac entrepreneur.
Yeah.
It truly is. I mean, it's, when you're fighting for every dollar you got up in here, it's like, it's what do you do? And so anyway, I say that in that I think that this is the most wonderful time of language learning.
Yeah. Well, and there's something you said, Bobby, that makes me think about, there's a group of friends that I have. Well, there's 3 of them of a group of 6 white men who are dads, who are in an intentional group to focus on just that. Right. And like, these are men that I love deeply. And then I found out they were doing this together. I was like, well, this is why I love y'all too. Like, I didn't even realize that they were doing this, because they never ever. And I mean, these are 3 of them I'm actually really good friends with. And that is part of their work, right? They take it very seriously. And then I would say the other thing is about the spaces that we create, right? For people of color, largely it's about divesting from not only white supremacy, but the internalized oppression that white supremacy has caused. And for white folks, it's divesting from the power and privilege, right? And doing exactly what you're talking about. So it's hard for all of us, our spaces to do that in, but we also need the spaces where we're coming back to rework and reconnect and then go back to do our work. So I hope online community can be a part of that.
Yeah, it is so fascinating to me because, especially in Anderson, South Carolina, there is only a small pockets of these spaces for dads and men who want to be a part of something, and we still don't have the language for it. And so when you don't have language, it's hard to connect with people when you don't have the language. And so faith communities have been the center point for that.
Listen. Yes. Sorry, because I'm saying that because actually I'm contemplating going back to restart my PhD, and it's around this very thing in terms of faith communities as the center for theological and social deconstruction around issues of race and dehumanization, right? And if our churches embodied that, you know what kind of power we could have?
It could be amazing. And and it's so hard. Okay, let me rephrase that. It is a great challenge for churches in the Southern Belt to have that conversation because it is considered political discourse.
Yeah.
Well, and I think like that's
And
actually
really,
anywhere in the United States, though, like, and particularly in the white mainline church. Like, you know, if I mention anything about like, so when I facilitate workshops on equity, I would say it's about 98% white folk. And I actually give them a caveat. It's like, you're going to hear me use the words whiteness and white supremacy a lot. And for the white people in the room, I need, like, if you feel uncomfortable, I actually need you to sit with those feelings of discomfort, because that's my life in the realm of mainline Protestantism. And so like that discomfort you feel, I need you to sit with that, and I need you to feel it, and I need you to kind of like be mindful with it and like let it sit with you and figure out why it's sitting with you. And I think like our
big
faith can be so powerful.
Golly, my brain's exploding right now.
If we're going to talk about incarnation,
Tuhina, you broke up.
How about now?
Yeah. Keep going.
Well, and I think like there's something really powerful about that within Christian community. You know, if we're going to talk about God incarnate in a poor, brown, Jewish Galilean peasant, and if we're really going to like take like the constructs that like powers and principalities have given us, and we're going to use those communities of faith to deconstruct that, like we could be amazing places for healing on so many different levels. Like I think like these are the places where we can really start to encounter death and resurrection in ways that we could never anticipate.
Absolutely.
I hate to say this, but I have this visual during this conversation that I admit that when I go to another white church and they're doing praise music, it's the most awkward thing I've ever seen in my life. But you walk into a black church that is doing their type of praise music, and what I mean by using the word they there, it is there. I mean, your hands go up straight. I mean, I'm not lying. I mean, to see a white person do praise music, I'm like, that person acting weird. But if I go to, I feel it, man. When I grew up, my great grandmother was probably one of the most racist person I've ever known. And it's just, and I hate to sound like I'm trying to justify it, but in ways she was a product of her time.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, but she loved going to a gospel church, and she'd sit there, and I mean, you go there at 9 o'clock, you don't leave till 2. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't end. And then you take a break and you go back at 5 until like 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
real.
anyway, and so you think about the central hubs of communities and how it's so hard to be intentional to take a predominantly white church and be a sister and a brother to a predominantly Black church and bring them together on a regular basis to worship, cross worship, and experience. Doesn't mean you have to bring them together all the time, but the people from the white church must go to the Black church go to the white church, and to create community and place of focus and place of opportunity of discourse. And I really think about like the challenge that people give me all the time, like, how many people do you spend time with of another person of color in your life? And I look at that and man, I get humbled, you know, based on geography, you know, and my geographic interactions on a daily basis. And I probably spend more time in a professional world interacting with people of color than in a personal world. And I could do a better job. But I have found more people of color having really richer discussions in establishments of faith.
Yeah.
And so I love the idea of what you're talking about is looking at the church as a center point of bringing people together to deconstruct many of their predispositions and many of the things that they grew up with to better accept the communities around them and to find common ground. I think that is a powerful, powerful conversation.
Yeah.
And to recognize,
No, please go ahead, Rozella.
No, and to recognize, you know, as someone who is a Black person in a primarily white faith institution who also would train and facilitate, right? And people would always say, we want more people of color. And I'd be like, well, why do you want more people of color, right? This recognition also that we want to jump to reconciliation and community before we do the work of repentance and reparation, right? And so this also in this work, and I mean, I'm fascinated by communities kind of yoking together to engage work, right? Like I think that could be a really powerful thing. Instead of trying to make a multicultural church, what if we had churches that were primarily one or another yoked together to engage in work, right? And to do it so that they could go back to spaces to also have safety, because white spaces are not safe inherently for people of color. And so whenever we like rush to dumping us into that or trying to converge it, it's like, yeah, but people are going to have to give up a part of themselves. And yes, that's what the gospel calls us to, but we live in a sinful world, right? So like, we have to, I think, manage those two realities as we're building this new reality, this new creation, this new beloved community. And I think that this could be the time. I think it's long been the time. I think we saw some of this after Charleston, but like, I think this is definitely the time for our communities of faith to do that. But again, I think it also starts with the leaders, right? If our leaders are not in intentionally multiracial groups or don't have accountability partners who look like them, who are then engaging with other folks who don't look like them, right? It's a little disingenuous for our churches to expect our people to do that, right? I think it has to be the both and.
You made me think of something. One of the biggest things in the digital world that absolutely drives me up a freaking wall is analytics. So the only way, you know, now that we have to broadcast or live stream lots of events from the church to people, not only to congregational members, but to community members. If you look inside the analytics, the demographic data is limited. It's only limited by age, location, gender, and then maybe a few other points of interest that are data points.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm fascinated about is that right now is the greatest time for people to be looking at other churches.
Mm-hmm.
They can sit at their home and they can look at 3 services at one time.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to know the racial crossover.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be completely fascinating to see how many people that wish they went across the street to the black church, but now they can't.
I think it would be that way too. I don't know that it would be that way.
I mean, amen. I think it would be fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I really get disappointed in a lot of the mainstream digital outlets that don't provide that reporting.
Yeah.
Because I think for people that are interested in research and truly to breaking down these digital barriers, you have to have those numbers in order to understand
Yes.
if you can connect with those communities.
Yep.
And but and once again, it's how do you identify from a racial standpoint? Like, Tuhina, how would you, if you had to refill out your Facebook profile, would you identify in a way that could put a number to your racial or color distinguishment? Does that make sense? Would you fill that out and feel comfortable?
Well, I mean, it's actually kind of entertaining because I just filled out my census form about a week and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that it was really interesting that they actually had the option for like Asian Indian American.
Oh.
Yeah. And I was like, what? I don't think I've never seen me on a piece of paper.
You tell your brother?
Yeah, I did tell Zubin. But yeah, it was one of those instances of like, I'm normally in spaces where I am not represented. And so that's why for me, representation matters so much. And I think like that is one of the reasons why I said yes to leadership in the church. Like I strongly believe this to be part of my call, is that so that if there are other young women of color who don't feel seen, who don't feel heard, who don't feel represented, like, I think like that's part of why, like, I think like that's part of actually what fuels my fight.
Mm. Yeah.
It's actually incarnational identity that's actually fuel for me to keep going. Because I think like there's a lot of times where I could have given up, where I could have just said, I'm out, Hinduism was awesome. See you later. But because I think like I've had the encounter with Jesus that I cannot shake, and that I've seen other people in the church, like I've met the women of color who have paved the way for me and who have given up so much so I could be here. And so I feel like as a Lutheran and as a Christian, and if I really am going to believe in the communion of saints, I've actually been given a responsibility to create that way for the people who come after me.
That's good stuff right there. I don't think I can follow up with that one.
I think that's a good word.
Yeah. And so, I hate, like, unfortunately, I have another meeting that I need to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
I mean, this has been a great hour. We did. It's a good conversation.
It's been great. I don't even know how to sum this one up. This is like covering it all.
Yeah.
Well, and I think like that's the other thing. We live in a world where like we think that we have to have things summed up. We think that we have to have things reconciled, and we think that we have to have things done. And I think that's a product of white supremacist productivity. Like we're nothing but cogs in a machine. We're nothing but like, avenues of which to produce products. And so I think like it's actually okay to.
We're capitalists, man. We're a bunch of white capitalists. I ain't lying.
Capitalism needs to go.
Yeah, I struggle with that as an entrepreneur. What does it mean to be anti-capitalist and be an entrepreneur? I haven't figured that out yet.
Look, I think this is where we leave it in a mess, where we just be like, you know what, this may not be able to be reconciled right now, and we'll just keep working toward it.
Well, Rozella, it has been a pleasure and an honor to meet with you. Thank you for, really empowering us to think differently. Thank you for challenging my way of thought. And I hope to connect with you again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Tuhina, for this connection.
Yes.
Tuhina, you rock as always.
Look, thank y'all for saying yes. Bobby, thank you for saying yes of we need an oral history of this time. And Rozella, thank you for saying yes to being part of the oral history.